Hey heroes, welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below along with other places you can find me. James Arthur Madrox, or Jamie as he preferred to be called, was born on September 7th in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The child of two scientists, Joan and Daniel Madrox, it was swiftly apparent that Jamie was unusual when the doctors slapped his bottom, triggering his ability to create an exact duplicate of himself upon physical impact. Presumably this initial duplicate vanished shortly after its creation, as the real Jamie could also reabsorb his copies without conscious thought, simply by touching them. You see, Jamie Madrox was a rare example of a mutant whose powers manifested at birth rather than during puberty. Suspecting this to be the case, Daniel and Joan consulted with an expert on genetic mutation, Professor Charles Xavier. At his suggestion, the couple resigned from their positions at a nuclear research facility and relocated to Kansas, where Jamie was homeschooled with a special computer provided by Xavier. The boy was also outfitted with a special impact-absorbing suit to help prevent him from accidentally creating more duplicates, or dupes as they would later be called. Initially, his parents kept his mutant nature from him, raising him on an isolated farm away from other children. But then one summer, just before Jamie turned 15, the Madrox family was visited by a man calling himself Damian Tryp. His story is somewhat complicated, so we won't dive into it too much here, but the short version is that he was an extremely long-lived superhuman, possibly another mutant, whose temporal abilities allowed him to communicate and interact with versions of himself from the past and the future. Like Madrox, his abilities were also evident from birth, and so he believed himself to be of a breed that was distinct from normal mutants, which he called kill crops. Suspecting that Jamie Madrox was like him, Damian Tryp attempted to convince Daniel and Joan to entrust their son into his care. When the couple refused, he erased Jamie's memory of his presence there before departing. He also generated a tornado that claimed the lives of Joan and Daniel, leaving no evidence of his involvement in their deaths. After that, Jamie lived alone on the Madrox farm, tending the fields and taking care of himself. He continued wearing his protective suit, but after 6 years without proper maintenance, its electronic control elements burned out, causing it to begin absorbing ambient electrical energy rather than kinetic. Confused, frightened, and lonely, Madrox wandered away from the farm for the first time in his life and started traveling east. Hoping to find help, his journey eventually took a 21-year-old Madrox to Manhattan, where he felt drawn to the Baxter Building. Astute Marvelites will likely recognize this as the New York headquarters of the world-famous Fantastic Four. As Madrox walked through the city, his malfunctioning suit continued to absorb electricity, causing blackouts wherever he went. The hot-headed Human Torch rushed off to confront him, leading to a battle between the two. The rest of the FF attempted to intervene, but any attempts to use force to stop the Multiple Man only resulted in the creation of even more dupes. Fortunately, the whole situation caught the attention of Professor Xavier when Cerebro detected that Madrox was in the city. Using his vast psychic powers, Xavier knocked out the dupes, giving Reed Richards time to completely shut down Jamie's malfunctioning suit. Freed from its effects, Jamie Madrox lost consciousness, and as a result, the dupes that he'd created during the fight vanished. After awakening and coming to his senses, Jamie was given an opportunity to join Xavier's students, the X-Men, but Madrox ultimately declined. Instead, he traveled to the Mutant Research Center on Scotland's Muir Island, where he stayed under the supervision of Xavier's ally, Moira McTaggart. With his suit no longer a problem, he also learned to more effectively use his mutant duplication powers and officially took the code name Multiple Man. He learned various methods of striking himself in such a way that he could voluntarily duplicate without hurting himself. Furthermore, each dupe was also creating more of themselves, allowing for fairly rapid multiplication. A maximum of around 40 total Madroxes could exist at once before his powers were taxed to their limit, but during this time he generally used less than half that. Not wanting excess copies of himself wandering around, he would regularly reabsorb his dupes, gaining their memories in the process. During this time, Madrox aided Moira as a lab assistant, but his early attempts to help in various conflicts tended to end poorly for him. For example, when he first came to the island, Moira was looking after Magneto, who had been transformed into an infant by an artificially created mutant called Alpha. When an alien known as Eric the Red attacked the facility to rescue Magneto and restore him to his prime, Madrox was ambushed and defeated. This incident was actually how he first met Alex Summers and Lorna Dane, aka Havoc and Polaris, as they were being mentally manipulated by Eric the Red at the time. After that whole conflict was resolved and the two former X-Men were freed from the aliens' mind control, they also took up residence on Muir Island, befriending Madrox as well. However, that incident then led into the next, as in the resulting battle between the X-Men and a restored Magneto, a special confinement cell containing a mutant known as Proteus was inadvertently damaged. The reality-warping son of Moira McTaggart, Proteus existed as a psionic entity that could possess the bodies of others. After Moira realized that her son had escaped and sounded the alarm, Madrox generated a squad of dupes to investigate. One of these duplicates succeeded in saving Lorna Dane from being possessed by Proteus, but was killed as a result. Still psionically linked to each of his duplicates, this was when Madrox first learned of the psychic backlash that he would experience when one of them was violently killed. Nonetheless, Proteus was able to possess the dupe's dead body and used it to escape before abandoning it somewhere where it was never found. He was ultimately defeated in a battle with the X-Men, but that is perhaps a story for another day. After that conflict, Cyclops offered Madrox a spot on the team, but he again declined, preferring to stay and aid Moira. During all of this, Jamie continued to view his dupes as little more than extensions of himself. Little did he realize that each one did possess the capacity for independent thought, and if separated from him for long enough, became capable of persisting whether the original Madrox was conscious or not. Eventually, he inadvertently created a dupe that did not want to be absorbed out of fear of losing its individual existence. Meanwhile, Muir Island was also home to Teresa Cassidy, aka Siren, daughter of the Irish mutant Banshee, who'd inherited similar sonic powers. This was also during the period that Magneto was watching over Xavier's students, the New Mutants. When he contacted Moira to ask for her help in this endeavor, she agreed to travel there and asked Teresa and Jamie to join her on the journey. However, it was the independent dupe that went with them by drugging the original Madrox and taking his place. During the trip, Teresa and the Madrox dupe discovered that the new mutant Sunspot and his alien ally Warlock had left the team and joined a group of adolescent superhumans called the Fallen Angels. Recognizing their leader as the mutant criminal Vanisher, Teresa and Jamie tried to convince Sunspot to return to the school. When that failed, they elected to stay with the group and keep an eye on him. Rather than operating like a traditional team of superheroes or even villains, the Fallen Angels saw themselves as social outcasts, who stayed together out of a sense of camaraderie. Nonetheless, their adventures took them to places like Dinosaur World, where they recruited Moon Boy and Devil Dinosaur, and Coconut Grove, the hedonistic homeworld of the fallen angel Ariel. Meanwhile, a relationship began to blossom between Teresa and the Rogue Dupe. Eventually, Sunspot and Warlock decided to stop running from their responsibilities and returned to the New Mutants. Teresa and Jamie elected to stay with the Fallen Angels in an attempt to keep the group on the right path. They did later return to Muir Island, and the Rogue Dupe erected a mental barrier to prevent the original Jamie Madrox from sensing his presence. The real Madrox, of course, had stayed on the island the entire time, but any discrepancies resulting from this went unnoticed when an interdimensional entity called the Shadow King telepathically manipulated the island's inhabitants for several months. Not wanting to risk being reabsorbed, the Rogue Dupe took advantage of the confusion and returned to the United States. Meanwhile, the Shadow King situation was ultimately dealt with by Professor Xavier and the X-Men. Prior to that conflict, Xavier's original 5 students had been operating as a separate group called X-Factor, but in the wake of the Shadow King's defeat, they rejoined the X-Men proper. Following this, an American operative named Valerie Cooper co-opted the name X-Factor for her own government-sponsored mutant team. She put together an all-new, all-different version of X-Factor, and one of her recruits was none other than Jamie Madrox, the Multiple Man. Meanwhile, the Rogue Dupe joined up with a group of mercenaries called the Nasty Boys. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because they were employed by the twisted geneticist Mr. Sinister. The whole situation with the Rogue Dupe started coming to a head when a U.S. Senator named Stephen Shafran sought to discredit X-Factor as part of a plot to further his own political career. Secretly a mutant known as Ricochet with the power to cloud other people's thoughts, Shafran forged an alliance with Sinister and the Nasty Boys to accomplish his goals. This gave the Rogue Dupe an idea. One way to discredit X-Factor would be to convince the public that the Multiple Man they employed was not the real Jamie Madrox. Furthermore, if they shook his sense of identity enough, made him believe that he was merely a dupe, then perhaps the Nasty Boy Madrox could absorb him and become the prime Jamie Madrox. The opening salvo in this plan came when the original Madrox, having traveled to DC with the rest of X-Factor, heard a knock on his apartment door. Cautious by nature, he decided to hide and sent a duplicate to investigate on his behalf. That proved to be the correct decision, as the dupe was immediately gunned down by a shotgun-wielding mercenary. The dupe's corpse fell out of the window, and Madrox hid amongst the gathering crowd until Cooper and his teammates arrived on the scene. He attempted to reabsorb the body to clean it up, but was actually surprised when he found that he couldn't. You see, to him, there shouldn't have been any difference between absorbing a dead dupe and a living one, since he didn't see them as being truly alive to begin with. The only other dupe to have been physically killed was the one that was taken by Proteus, and that body was never found. For the first time in his life, he began to question the nature of his powers and was shaken by the implications. Things only got worse while X-Factor was being introduced to the world with a public press conference. When Cooper and the team started taking questions, the Rogue Dupe stepped forward from the crowd and claimed to be the real Jamie Madrox. This led to a scuffle, well, I was going to say between the two, but it quickly turned into more than that, particularly since the dupe needed to avoid being absorbed. They were both ultimately apprehended by the other members of X-Factor, who were determined to suss out the truth. The Nasty Boy Madrox claimed that he wanted to get away from Muir Island for a while, but left a dupe behind to cover for him. Faking the results of a polygraph test, he successfully convinced Cooper that he was the original. His claim was bolstered by the fact that he was the same Madrox who joined the Fallen Angels, and thus the real Jamie had no memory of those events. The whole deception was further aided by Ricochet's ability to cloud people's judgment with his mutant powers. With all the pieces in place, the Rogue Dupe made his final push to convince the real Jamie Madrox to surrender. Playing along with this, Madrox allowed himself to be absorbed, ceding control of their combined form to the dupe. However, this was part of Jamie's own plan, and as he suspected, his consciousness did not fade away like a dupe's would have. Instead, he was able to essentially dismantle the rogue Jamie from the inside out until the real Madrox popped back into existence, regenerating his body and absorbing the dupe at the same time. Gaining the dupe's memories but not his personality, the restored Multiple Man rejoined X-Factor, defeated the Nasty Boys, and exposed Senator Shafran's plot. Never actually intending on letting him become president, Sinister also betrayed Ricochet, posing as the senator in a televised battle with X-Factor. Shafran attempted to take revenge by using a gun given to him by Sinister, but was killed by his own bullet when it bounced off the invulnerable villain. Following these events, Jamie Madrox remained a consistent member of X-Factor and used his duplication powers in a variety of missions. He developed a reputation as the practical joker of the group, although his attention-seeking behavior ultimately stemmed from a fear of returning to the loneliness he experienced in his teenage years. His sense of humor was shared by his teammate Guido Carosella, aka Strong Guy, and the two forged a close friendship. For one mission, Madrox and another X-Factor member, Quicksilver, were sent to Maine to apprehend a wanted mutant known as Rhapsody. Formerly a music teacher named Rachel Argosy, she was the opposite of Jamie in one regard. Whereas his mutant powers were evident from birth, hers did not fully manifest until she was 20 years old, when her skin turned blue. She gained the ability to create psionic hallucinations as long as she had music to focus her power through. She also had a limited form of telekinesis, allowing her to levitate herself and others as long as the music continued. While Argosy was very popular with her students, a number of parents complained to the school board about a visible mutant teaching their children. This led to her firing, with her most vocal detractor being a board member by the name of Harry Sharp. 2 days after that, Sharp was found dead in his home, and Argosy was seen fleeing the scene. X-Factor were called in to help, which led to Madrox and Quicksilver being sent to apprehend her. The two cornered her in a nearby warehouse where she used her music to entrance them both. Jamie was pulled into an illusory vision of his isolated Kansas farm, where Rhapsody began to seduce him. But due to their psionic connection, a squad of dupes sensed that he had fallen under her spell and covered their ears, leading to Rhapsody's arrest. Nonetheless, Jamie was smitten with Rachel, and when she insisted that she hadn't done anything to hurt Harry Sharp, Madrox promised to help prove her innocence. He even later returned to free her from jail, only to find that she had already unlocked her cell by using her powers on a young guard, but was waiting for him. The two left together, but then Rhapsody admitted that she had in fact visited Harry Sharp on the night that he died. She was trying to show him the positive side of her hallucinogenic powers, but accidentally killed him when they overwhelmed his heart. Shocked and betrayed, Madrox brought Rhapsody back to jail before returning to Washington with Quicksilver. Later, there was an incident in which the mutant freedom fighter Cable was framed for an attempted assassination of Professor Charles Xavier. As a result, X-Factor joined forces with the X-Men to apprehend Cable's mutant strike team, X-Force. And it just so happens that one member of X-Force was Teresa Cassidy, aka Siren, who was on the Fallen Angels with the Madrox dupe. She tried to remind him of the brief romance they shared, not seeing why it mattered that it was through a duplicate. Jamie explained that while he did indeed possess the dupe's memories, that didn't mean he inherited any romantic feelings it may have had. The situation with Cable was eventually cleared up when it was discovered that he'd been framed by his evil clone, Strife. Later, X-Factor traveled to the island nation Genosha, whose mutate population was being threatened by the deadly Legacy virus. We've talked about Genosian mutates on the channel before, but they're basically mutants who were sterilized and conditioned to serve the state as slave labor. Although by this point the country was being run by a less oppressive government that operated under sanctions imposed by the United Nations. When an infected mutate escaped from quarantine, the members of X-Factor donned special hazmat suits and attempted to find him before he was hunted down and killed by Genosian magistrates. It was Madrox who found him first, but by the time he did, the mutate was already going into cardiac arrest. In an attempt to save the mutate's life, Madrox created an unprotected dupe to perform CPR. He succeeded in prolonging the life of the mutate, who admitted that he only ran because he didn't want to die being used as a lab rat. Madrox was soon found by other members of X-Factor, but by then he had, perhaps inadvertently, absorbed the dupe. They brought the mutate to a hospital bed where he could pass away peacefully, but Madrox hid the truth of what he'd done from his teammates. He subsequently isolated himself and relied on uninfected duplicates to cover for him. But by this point his dupes began displaying even more individuality than before, with some facet of his personality often being exaggerated in each duplicate. I should also note that it's been unclear whether the infected Jamie Madrox was truly the original or yet another dupe, but he himself seemed to believe himself to be the real Jamie. He succeeded in creating more dupes without infecting them, but as his condition worsened, they began to emerge faceless and mindless. And so some healthy dupes separated themselves, subconsciously refusing to be reabsorbed so that part of him might survive. Desperate for help, the infected Madrox turned to a mutant supervillain named Haven, who offered to use her powers to cure him. She indeed made the attempt, but much to her surprise, failed to cure the virus, and Jamie Madrox died. It seems that most of his duplicates vanished when he died, but at least one remained alive, free of the legacy virus. However, the psychic backlash resulting from the death of what may have been his original body rendered the surviving Madrox amnesiac. He found himself drawn to X-Factor's headquarters in Washington, but unfortunately the building was empty when he arrived. He continued wandering and was spotted by Valerie Cooper, who chased after him, but since he didn't recognize her, he fled. He was eventually found and taken into custody by rogue government operatives who offered to help him, but they sought to exploit his powers, turning him into a literal one-man army. His memory eventually began to return, but his government handlers refused to let him return to X-Factor. Fortunately, he was rescued from the situation by his former teammate, Havoc, who was putting together his own incarnation of the Brotherhood, for reasons that we'll talk about in more detail another time. Madrox declined his invitation to join, but knew that the government would be after him and went into hiding, with Havoc warning that X-Factor may go after him. Sure enough, the federal government did dispatch the mutant team to find him on trumped-up charges, albeit without specifying that Madrox was the one they were after. Furthermore, by this point the group's roster had changed considerably, with known criminals like Mystique and Sabretooth added to the mix. They did eventually find him, leading to the question of if it was the original Jamie who died or one of his dupes. However, it seems that his perception of his powers had evolved. Rather than only seeing one individual as the real Jamie Madrox, each dupe was simply part of the whole entity. Although it doesn't seem like this perspective really lasted. In any event, after this he decided to have at least two of his other selves with him at any given time to prevent himself from ever truly dying. He also visited the grave of the Madrox who succumbed to the legacy virus, as his death had indeed changed the way that he looked at things. He subsequently reunited with his best friend, a strong guy, who had only recently recovered from a heart attack-induced coma. Guido had been placed in government custody to prevent Havoc from recruiting him into his brotherhood, but Madrox helped free him, leading to a fight with the government troops that were guarding him. However, Guido's heart was still weak, and the strenuous activity threatened to induce another heart attack. He was rescued by Polaris and Forge, the latter of whom created a device to work with Guido's mutant power to strengthen his heart, but Madrox blamed himself for almost getting his best friend killed. He slipped away, but was later contacted again by Havoc, who wanted to put together a new X-Factor free from government interference. This time Madrox considered joining, but those plans fell apart when Havoc was seemingly killed in an explosion and X-Factor disbanded. Lacking direction and feeling as though his sheltered upbringing had denied him life experiences, he created numerous dupes and sent them out into the world, intending for them to eventually return and rejoin him, sharing what they'd learned and experienced. The main Madrox, meanwhile, returned to Muir Island, where Moira, McTaggart, and the Beast worked to find a cure for the legacy virus. Of course, there's more we could talk about when it comes to Madrox the Multiple Man, so if you'd like to know about what happened with some of those Explorer dupes, or about the founding of X-Factor investigations, then let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, that is all I have for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out and thank you to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here. But Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered in the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there is anything in particular you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. After all, I always need suggestions for patrons to vote on. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!